BioWare is dead. In just a few years, BioWare has gone from being one of the most respected game studios in the world to now being a laughingstock.
Why did one of the most beloved gaming studios in history lose its way?
Oh my fucking god, what is wrong with your face?
Is BioWare destined to fumble yet again?
Disastrous BioWare release.
One of the most unmitigated disaster decades of any major game studio.
So what happened? For some of you, your first experience with BioWare may have been with Baldur's Gate 1 or 2, which released in 1998 and 2000. But for many, their first introduction to BioWare was through Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic. To put it lightly, this game was a smash hit.
She is the friend that everybody deserves.
It went on to sell millions of copies, it won multiple Game of the Year awards, and today it's considered one of the greatest video games of all time. It's really wild to look back at these incredible games and compare them to what we've gotten from BioWare recently, because that really shows us how far the studio has fallen. Luckily though, some of us were there to experience the true golden age of BioWare in real time.
Do you hear something?
After Knights of the Old Republic, BioWare went on to release a game called Jade Empire. I believe this was BioWare's first, if not one of their first forays into original IP. And although Jade Empire didn't reach the massive sales of their previous games, it was very well received. I still remember being in awe of the first couple hours of this game. You're introduced to your character who's studying martial arts in a quaint Chinese village, and before you know it, fireballs are raining down from the sky and you're forced to flee as you watch your village, your friends, and your entire life go up in flames.
No! This can't be! Everyone is gone.
Maybe that opening sequence was foreshadowing, but luckily before the fireballs destroyed BioWare, the studio was able to cook up their first installment to a beautiful space opera. Mass Effect. This is probably one of the greatest science fiction video game series of all time. The action, the drama, the romance, the adventure, the tragedy. This thing, besides the amazing story and the excellent character writing, the score for these games. It had no business being this good. About a month before Mass Effect's release came the bombshell announcement that Electronic Arts would be acquiring the studio. Now, I don't want to be dramatic and say that this was the beginning of the end for BioWare and that it immediately fell off after this acquisition, because that's not the case. It's far from it, actually. And a huge reason for that is BioWare, the studio, maintained its leadership. And BioWare went on to release a slew of hits. They released the first game in the Dragon Age franchise in 2009, Mass Effect 2 in 2010, followed by Dragon Age 2 in 2011, and Mass Effect 3 in 2012. Now, disregarding the controversy surrounding Mass Effect 3's ending, these games were all critically acclaimed and well received by players. But just a few months after Mass Effect 3's release is when the cracks started to form. BioWare's original founders left the studio altogether. One of BioWare's co-founders, Greg Zeschuk, talked about leaving BioWare in a recent podcast, and he kind of just chalked his departure up to not enjoying company culture.
But you have to understand how to work within a big company. And for me, that was the end. It was like, oh, I don't like big companies. And so I knew by year 2 that I was going to leave at some point.
But regardless of the reason, when the founders of a studio leave in this way, it's a huge deal. And part of the problem is it took EA a whole year to find people to lead BioWare the studio. And once they did, for the next 2 years, BioWare worked on 2 games. One was an online action RPG called Shadow Realms, which was later canceled. And the other one was, well, the last great Dragon Age game, Inquisition. Now, I myself am a pretty big fan of Inquisition. I think it had a great story, excellent characters, and I'll never forget that scene where you go to that party and meet Vivian.
You know such rudeness is intolerable.
Wow. Dragon Age Inquisition went on to be crowned 2014's Game of the Year. But it was around this time when the BioWare team was hard at work on the 4th Mass Effect game when something major happened.
I'm Jamin Hatfield, and this is IGN News. Casey Hudson, creator of the Mass Effect series, announced he is leaving developer BioWare today. He began a 16-year stint as an artist on Neverwinter Nights, and then was project director on Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. He also led development on the Mass Effect trilogy.
There was this mass exodus at BioWare, or Mass Effectedus, we can call it. If I had to go back and pinpoint an exact moment that kind of marked the beginning of the end for BioWare, beyond the co-founders leaving the studio, this event that happened around the Mass Effect 4 era is it. Because when BioWare's talent started to leave, everything at BioWare began falling apart. Casey Hudson, the creator of the Mass Effect series, left BioWare in May 2014. Gerard Lianey, Mass Effect's creative director, left the same year. Chris Wynn and Chris Schlerf, both of whom had been working on Mass Effect 4, left in December 2015 and February 2016, respectively. It almost kind of seems like they knew something bad was coming, and that big bad was Mass Effect Andromeda. Andromeda was pretty much hated on release, and that's a problem because people were not set out to hate on this game. They wanted it to be great. Mass Effect had a huge community of fans who were eagerly anticipating this game, but when people got their hands on it, they realized something was missing.
This is next generation? This is what it looks like?
Actually, that's an understatement. Everything was missing. Everything that made the Mass Effect game special, the charm, the excellent story, those characters that you really were invested in. All of that was noticeably absent. Mass Effect Andromeda had this much lighter feel to it, and while critics applauded the game's visuals and combat, they felt that the story, characters, and voice acting fell short. Not to mention, Andromeda was shipped with a whole host of technical issues.
Sorry, my face is tired.
But worst of all for EA, Andromeda was a commercial failure. In the grand scheme of things, it's hard to say exactly what caused the game to flop so hard, but I really think it comes down to a lack of talent and direction. I'm not saying the people who worked on the game were bad at their job, it's just that perhaps they lacked the experience of the individuals who had worked on the previous Mass Effect installments. Remember, during the game's development, a lot of those people had left. There were also a bunch of changes made during Andromeda's development that were likely to the game's detriment. I believe they switched from Unreal Engine, which is what the previous games were made in, to Frostbite, which is like an engine that EA themselves created. At one point, they were even trying to make procedurally generated planets, but they ended up scrapping that idea. It really just seems like the people who were in charge of making the important decisions were confused or didn't know what they were doing. Regardless, the leadership was not leading, and there was a complete lack of direction. After Andromeda's failure, BioWare released the first installment to a new IP called Anthem.
How cool was that trailer?
Which released in 2019 to mixed reviews.
The live service that EA had their hopes and dreams on that launched to, well, relatively tepid Metacritic scores and user scores alike.
Also, funny coincidence, just a few days ago, EA announced that they're shutting down Anthem servers. But neither Andromeda nor Anthem's failures could prepare us for the final blow to the house of BioWare that was...
You have no idea what you have done.
Dragon Age: The Veilguard. Now, it's important to note that by the time Veilguard released, the majority of the people who had worked on the 3 previous Dragon Age games had actually left BioWare. David Gator, the lead writer for the previous Dragon Age games, left in 2016 after 17 years at BioWare. Mike Laidlaw, the creative director of the previous Dragon Age games, left in 2017 after 14 years at BioWare. And James Olin, the lead designer for previous Dragon Age games, left in 2018 after 22 years at BioWare. Those are 3 huge names and immense talents that were at BioWare for decades. They played a massive role in the success of previous Dragon Age games. So by the time Veilguard was released, the studio that had created masterpieces like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and the Mass Effect trilogy and the first 3 Dragon Age games, Jade Empire, etc., that studio did not exist anymore. And it showed.
I also used to wet the bed. Want me to start that up again? Nobody likes being a woman. Who ate the last breaded cheese wand?
And the remaining 30 hours were just excruciatingly painful as I was forced to suffer through the endless morass of banality that is Dragon Age: The Veilguard.
So when you look at it that way, it's not really a surprise that Veilguard flopped, right? Now again, I'm not saying all the people who worked on the Veilguard were terrible at what they were doing, but we cannot deny that there were some questionable decisions that were made when it came to things like character writing in the Veilguard. And as much as we can all differ on where we see things from a social perspective or political perspective, whatever, we cannot play pretend and act like the memes.
So, I'm non-binary.
Who the fuck starts a conversation like that? I just sat down.
And all the jokes that came out of scenes like this one did not contribute to the game's failure. Okay? But more so, I believe it was mismanagement that really sealed this game's fate. For those who don't know, Veilguard had essentially gone through 3 different iterations by the time it finally reached players. It started off like the previous Dragon Age games as a single-player experience, and then under EA's direction, it was reworked into a small-scale multiplayer game with microtransactions, before eventually being reverted back to a single-player game. These kinds of changes are not good for a game's development. In a bombshell report by Bloomberg, a source recalled how EA had sent down a message to the Dragon Age team saying that they no longer wanted Veilguard to be a single-player game, and that the team needed to turn it into a multiplayer live service game. When Dragon Age's creative director Mike Laidlaw heard this news, he quit on the spot. He had been working there for 14 years. That's how bad things were. So when Dragon Age the Veilguard went on to sell like 1/12 of its predecessor and was essentially a commercial and critical failure in a lot of ways, the only individuals who were surprised were executives at EA. This game's failure hit EA so hard that they had to do the thing corporations hate doing most: lower their earnings forecast. Wow. But in typical EA fashion, instead of bringing on new talent or changing up leadership, EA fired about half of BioWare's staff, bringing the studio's workforce from around 200 to now less than 100. Veilguard was the final blow. And while I do think the team at BioWare is responsible for the game they created, including some of the creative liberties they took with the game's narrative that didn't really resonate with players, I also think it's unfair to put all of the blame on them. David Gator, who I mentioned was a lead writer on a few BioWare games, spoke pretty candidly about the work culture at BioWare in recent years. To quote Gator, "Even BioWare, which built its success on a reputation for good stories and characters, slowly turned from a company that vocally valued its writers to one where we were quietly resented, with a reliance on expensive narratives seen as the albatross holding the company back." Maybe that sounds like a heavy charge, but it's what I distinctly felt up until I left in 2016. Suddenly, all anyone in charge was asking was, how do we have less writing? A good story would simply happen via magic wand, rather than be something that needed support and priority. So yeah, we can make fun of the Veilguard team and some of the choices they made with the story and with the characters, but truthfully, it sounds like those who were in charge, who had been placed in those positions by EA, did not respect or value talent.
Many people are now more worried than ever about what comes next from BioWare.
And now that team of less than 100 are allegedly working on the 5th installment to the Mass Effect series. I personally have zero hopes or expectations that Mass Effect 5 is going to be anything close to what we got in the original trilogy. Because again, the studio that created those amazing games is now a shell of what it once was. BioWare as we know it is dead. But there is a glimmer of hope. Not for BioWare, I mean, they're screwed. A group of ex-BioWare developers formed a studio called Archetype Entertainment, and they're currently working on a Mass Effect-like game called Exodus. It appears to be a narrative-driven RPG, and as you can see from the trailer, it looks pretty cool, right? And it might just be the spiritual successor to the Mass Effect trilogy that we've all been waiting for. Also think it's kind of funny, the game was introduced rather fittingly by Matthew McConaughey.
Matthew McConaughey!
You know, of Interstellar fame.
No! 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 No!
At the 2023 Game Awards.
So now I am proud to share the first ever look at Exodus.
James Olin, Chad Robertson, and Drew Karpyshyn, all of whom are ex-BioWare veterans, are leading Exodus's development. Now, I try not to get too hype about upcoming games, but from what I've seen so far, I'm very impressed. They've literally developed a huge amount of lore for this game. Alien species, technology, entire planets. The world building here looks insane. And apparently the game is coming in 2026. So let's hope they can deliver on this, because I know a lot of us who were fans of the old Mass Effect games are really eager to get our hands on a great sci-fi experience.
It would be our salvation.
The demise of BioWare is probably one of the most depressing moments in video game history. At least for me it is. At its peak, this studio delivered some of the best games of all time, but now it's been stripped of its parts. What happened to BioWare is such an astronomical failure. But what's crazy is that EA doesn't seem to care at all. Most of their revenue comes from their sports division in games like Apex Legends and The Sims, with one analyst estimating that BioWare games account for just 5% of EA's annual revenue. But the thing is, that wasn't always the case. Historically, BioWare games have made EA so much money. According to Games Industry, Mass Effect 3 alone brought in $200 million in retail sales. Dragon Age Inquisition moved 12 million units. These are massive figures. Regardless of what EA might think, single-player games are alive and well. Clair Obscur Expedition 33, Baldur's Gate 3, Elden Ring, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Hell, even Hogwarts Legacy was the best-selling game of 2023. These are all single-player titles with massive sales that prove there is still a huge market for single-player games. But the harsh reality is, the BioWare that exists today, I don't think is capable of creating a good single-player game. So in the end, what's transpired with BioWare is the same thing we've seen happen to other once great studios like Bethesda and Blizzard. Giants that have fallen at the hands of corporate greed and mismanagement. But out of the ashes rise these new studios that value talent, quality, and most importantly, we the players. So maybe BioWare's death is for the best. Although the body is gone, the games will always remain.
Who ate the last breaded cheese wand?
Not that one though.
Okay.
That one can rot in hell.
Looking so phenomenal, hit me like a kick to my abdominal. I can't shake